5.
Just say I've got another meeting at 6. I will need
Okay.
that point.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Geological Society's public lecture entitled A Deep Time Perspective on Climate and Ecology. Just as a reminder, throughout this lecture, your microphone will be muted and your video cameras will be switched off. You'll only be able to hear and see the speaker. My name's Graham Shields. I'm a professor of geology at the University College London, and I'm the chair of the Society's Earth System Science Group. Before we start, I'd like to hand over to Professor Dan Lunt at the University of Bristol, who is the leader of the new scientific theme, Climate and Ecology. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Graham. Yeah, I thought I'd just before we get onto the main event of Erin speaking, I just thought I'd introduce very briefly this new theme that we have at the GeolSoc, the Climate and Ecology theme, and the talk today is really sort of the kickoff event really for this new theme. So yeah, the climate ecology theme arose, I guess, at least in part initially because the GeolSoc decided to update its statement on climate change. This was sort of the third iteration of that statement, and the result was published a couple of years ago in the Journal of the GeolSoc. And this paper sort of highlighted the main contributions that geology has made to the understanding of climate change, how the geological record informs future change, and also the role that geology and geologists have to play in the transition to a more sustainable, low carbon, I guess ultimately no carbon future. And obviously, as well as climate changes, ecological changes are of huge importance to the planet and society. Many of you will know about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill proposed by Caroline Lucas and others that really recognizes the fact that the climate and ecological emergencies need to be tackled together, committing not only to the 1.5 degree warming target, but also halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. So yeah, climate changes and ecological changes are both aspects that are hugely societally relevant today, and two of the major challenges of our generation. They're also both fields in which geologists can make a hugely important contribution. And I think it's really nice that the climate and ecology have been brought together in this new theme, which is just been announced. And no one really embodies more this synergy between climate and ecology than today's speaker, Erin Saup, who investigates interactions between life and environments over geological timescales. So yeah, Erin, really looking forward to your talk. And I'll hand over to Graham to introduce you properly.
So today I'd like to introduce Professor Erin Saup, today's speaker. Erin is an associate professor of paleobiology at the University of Oxford, the Department of Earth Sciences. Erin's research investigates the interactions between life and environments over geological timescales. She's specifically interested in elucidating the controls on community and species responses to environmental change across various spatial and temporal scales. Before joining the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Oxford, she was a research fellow at the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies at Yale University. Now today, Erin will discuss her integration of fossil and modern data to disentangle some of the long-term ecological and evolutionary responses of species to climate change. More specifically, Erin will discuss some of her recent research that examines potential climate mechanisms responsible for the latitudinal diversity gradient, the role of geography in regulating extinction magnitude during climate change, and the degree to which climate has shifted the geographic distributions of entire groups over time. These studies provide a bottom-up perspective on the generation and maintenance of biodiversity under climate change and enhance our understanding of the interaction of species' intrinsic macroecological characteristics with the dynamic extrinsic climate. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Erin. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'll share my screen now. and pop that on. Can you see that? Is that all right? Can everybody see?
Yeah, we can.
Fantastic. Yeah, so again, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. Thanks, Graham, for the introduction, and Dan Lunt for the invitation. Much of my research does focus on how climate affects species on this earth today, into the future, and in the past. And I focus on how climate can trigger the origination of new species, how climate can instigate extinction, and how climate affects where species are found on Earth, referred to as species distributions or geographic distributions. And today I'll discuss 3 studies that examine the relationship between climate and ecology, specifically with regard to how climate has shifted species geographic distributions over the last 50 million years, how climate may affect the number of species in certain regions on Earth over time, and how climate may interact with the configuration of land masses to regulate extinction intensity. We know that there have been significant shifts in where we find species and groups on Earth over time. So for example, lions, hippos, rhinos, elephants were living right here in the UK during the Pleistocene 125,000 years ago. And we can actually dig up their skeletons in Trafalgar Square in London. And these shifts in where groups are found are important to consider because they affect communities and ecosystems, and as a result, they can instigate extinctions. So in the first study that I'll talk to you about today, I focused on distributional changes in 10 ecologically distinct bird groups. And this is work done in collaboration with Dan Field at the University of Cambridge and others like Dan Lunt actually at the University of Bristol. The groups we focused on range from nocturnal frogmouths, which look a bit like this. They do not fly long distances. They primarily eat insects, to mouse birds that eat only berries and are very acrobatic, to seriemas, which spend most of their time walking on long, strong legs in grasslands, savannas, and dry forests. The thing that unites these 10 very different groups is that they are limited to southern land masses such as Africa, Southern America, Australia, New Zealand, New Caledonia today, but they have fossils found from very different regions of the world, thousands of kilometers away, including in the Western United States and in Northern Europe. So for example, fossil representatives of these groups were found in rocks that date from the Eocene about 54 million years ago to the Oligocene about 28 million years ago. And what is interesting is this pattern where fossil groups are found in the Northern Hemisphere, but the living representatives of these groups are found in the Southern Hemisphere, is observed repeatedly across a lot of different groups of animals and plants. So from archaeid spiders, which I'm showing you here, they are very weird looking. They have a long neck and really long chelicerae or fangs, to things like carnivorous plants. So this group, for example, here is found only in Southern Africa today, but a fossil was discovered in Baltic amber from about 44 million years ago. And the discovery of these fossils, such a long distance from where their modern representatives are living today, illustrates the power and utility of the fossil record. It can reveal information about where groups were distributed in the past that we wouldn't actually know from studying only living species. So it seems that bird distributional patterns have dramatically changed over time and are far more complex than we would assume if we were only studying living members of these groups. Since we saw the same pattern replicated across so many bird groups, we hypothesized that changing climate over the last 50 plus million years might have been responsible for actually driving these shifts in where these bird groups are found. In warmer times, for example, these birds might have been able to live in places like the UK, but as the climate began cooling, especially starting about 30 million years ago, it might have caused these groups to disappear from higher latitudes. So to test this hypothesis, we wanted to ask whether we could predict the fossil localities for these birds way up in places like the UK millions of years ago, using estimates of their climatic conditions that they live in today, so their tolerances that they have today. And to do this, I can actually generate models of the tolerances of these groups today, and then project where might have been suitable for these groups over time in the deep past, millions of years ago. So to quantify these groups' environmental tolerances, I used a technique called ecological niche modeling. And in a nutshell, ecological niche modeling is simply a mathematical modeling technique that generates estimates for what conditions might be suitable for a species and what conditions might be unsuitable for a species. And using this technique of ecological niche modeling, I characterized the present day tolerances for each of the 10 bird groups using these 4 environmental data layers that you see here, which capture dimensions of precipitation and temperature. And these were obtained in collaboration with Alex Farnsworth and Dan Lunt at the University of Bristol. So taking the present day tolerances for these bird groups, I could then examine where might have been suitable for the groups during the Euprasian, for example, 50 million years ago, the Pre-Ibonian, 35 million years ago, the Rupellian, 30 million years ago, and the Chattian, 25 million years ago. And what I found is that the areas of suitability for these groups are very different from the areas of suitability today. So this is an estimate where might have been suitable for mouse birds 50 million years ago based on their present day tolerances, and the suitable area is in pink. And you can see that the UK would have been suitable, and excitingly, I could actually predict where the fossils are found. So this is illustrated here with the yellow stars. So the yellow stars represent fossil localities, and they actually correspond with suitable habitat in pink that was predicted for this time period based on the present day tolerances for this group. And this is not because the entire world is suitable. Of course, I could predict fossils if I'm predicting everywhere as suitable. Only certain latitudinal bands are predicted as suitable. And this same pattern is actually true for the other groups that I looked at as well, including the frog mouse, which is what I'm showing you here. So I can, again, characterize the present day tolerances for this group and project the suitable conditions back 50 million years and correctly predict where we find fossils. So we can actually quantify how suitable habitat may have changed through time for these groups. And what you see is a general shift towards the equator for all of the studied groups. So this is illustrated by these graphs that have time on the x-axis going from the Euprasian, that's about 50 million years ago, towards the present, towards the right. And then latitude is on the y-axis, so you go from the equator to the poles. And essentially what you can see is that on average, the center or centroid of suitable habitat for these groups is projected to shift towards the equator. And on average, the shift is about 30 degrees, which is over 3,000 kilometers. So since we can use the present day tolerances for these groups to predict where, at least in part, they were distributed millions of years ago, it suggests that the tolerances are remarkably stable over 50 plus million years for these groups. And this is a really interesting ecological insight, and it speaks to the ability of life to adapt, or in fact, not adapt to climate change. And our results also suggest that climatic cooling caused dramatic changes in the distribution of these groups over the course of the Cenozoic, over this 50 plus million year interval. So 2 scenarios were possible. The groups were either once widespread and are now relictual in the Southern Hemisphere, or they originated in the Northern Hemisphere and then were pushed or shifted south through time. And the ecological niche modeling results best support this scenario 1. But either way, the fossil record provides really dramatic evidence of large-scale shifts in the distribution of these groups, which the modeling suggests is likely driven by climate change. And this would have been obscured if we were only looking at modern species today. So I just discussed how climate can drive large-scale shifts in the distribution of groups over millions of years. And I'm going to transition now to discuss how climate can drive diversification and potentially generate the largest of ecological patterns that we know about, and that is of spatial diversity gradients. So what are diversity gradients? Well, the diversity gradient is one of the most prominent ecological patterns and also one of the longest known ecological patterns. Essentially, latitudinal diversity gradients describe the pattern of increasing numbers of species as you travel from the poles to the equator, so as you go from more temperate regions to the tropics. And it was first recognized over 200 years ago when Alexander von Humboldt noted diversity might be higher at the equator than at the poles. And ever since this discovery, there have been many hypotheses proposed for why we see higher diversity in the tropics, over 100 hypotheses. And what is really exceptional about the latitudinal diversity gradient is the pervasiveness of the pattern. So we find diversity gradients on land, like you see here for vertebrate diversity. We see them in the sea, like you see here for copepod diversity. And we see them not only just in animals, but we also find diversity gradients in plants, like you see here. And although many hypotheses have been proposed to explain this diversity gradient, there are only 3 that can actually directly cause species numbers to increase or vary across space. And those 3 processes are speciation, extinction, and dispersal. So with regard to speciation, debate has centered on whether we get more species in the tropics because more species evolve in the tropics than outside the tropics. With regard to extinction, debate has centered on whether the tropics house more species just because extinction rates might be lower in the tropics compared to outside the tropics. And of course, if this is the case, if rates are lower, this would also build up species in the tropics. And then finally, with regard to dispersal, debate has centered on whether dispersal of species occurs primarily into the tropics, which would help to build up the number of species we have there, or if it occurs primarily out of the tropics, which of course wouldn't help to build up species at low latitudes. Although speciation, extinction, and dispersal are the only 3 processes that can directly generate the latitudinal diversity gradient, the actual causes of differing speciation and extinction by latitude are far less well understood. So what is actually responsible for speciation rates being elevated in certain regions over others? What is responsible for extinction rates differing by regions on Earth? Well, I think climate might be the key, and specifically how climate changes across space and through time. And we can refer to this as spatiotemporal climate change. And our hypothesis was that climate change, both across space and through time at low latitudes, so in the tropics, could drive higher rates of speciation there and therefore pile up those species that we have in the tropics. So why might this matter? Why might more spatially temporal heterogeneous climate change matter at low latitudes? Well, just like we heard in the previous study on shifting bird distributions, climate change can affect where species can live on Earth as some areas become unsuitable for species and other areas become newly suitable for species. And the idea is that the dynamics of climate change may cause species geographic ranges to become more fragmented at low latitudes than at high latitudes. And as a result of this, this would cause higher rates of speciation at low latitudes via the isolation of populations. We refer to this as allopatric speciation. And this allopatric speciation, this higher rate of allopatric speciation at low latitudes, would then create the latitudinal diversity gradient. So this is the hypothesis. And I, along with some of my colleagues, so Huey Chow, Town Peterson, Jorge Soberón, and Corinne Myers, tested this hypothesis using a simulation modeling approach. So using this simulation modeling framework, which I'll introduce in a moment, we tried to replicate the latitudinal diversity gradient using only a few assumptions about how species interact and respond to climate change, and specifically climate change over the last 120,000 years. And using a simulation framework, I think, is really important because it allows us to disentangle and identify potential drivers of the latitudinal diversity gradient, which is really difficult to do when just looking, for example, at the modern, or when you're just using correlative approaches, where, for example, you correlate temperature with diversity. You might find a correlation in this instance, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what is actually driving the pattern. So the modeling framework that I used relied on virtual species, but the virtual species were based on knowledge from real vascular plant species, which do exhibit strong gradients in species richness. So just as an example, tropical forests are typically an order of magnitude more diverse than temperate forests at higher latitudes. So how does this modeling simulation framework work? Well, the virtual species that I created could move across a landscape that was divided into grid cells, and they could move based on their dispersal ability. So this was assigned by me, and they could also only occupy grid cells that were climatically suitable for them, and this was also assigned by me. The climatic conditions, though, in grid cells would change through time, depending on how the climate was changing. And this, of course, would affect whether those cells actually remain suitable for the species. So in this case, the changing climate conditions were represented by a 120,000 year record of terrestrial climate change over the Pleistocene. So year 0, in this case, is 120,000 years ago. And then we're stepping forward into the present every 100 years. And each point here represents a point on Earth with a specific temperature and precipitation condition. And you can see actually how these conditions shift and change through time at this particular point on Earth. And these climate data were obtained in collaboration with Joy Singh Iyer at the University of Reading and Paul Valdez at the University of Bristol. So each of these little virtual species that I created was started from a particular point on the globe in this gridded world. And then from this point, a species could begin to interact with the environment, interact with that climate change, and search for suitable habitat. So how did we assign suitable habitat or the tolerances for these virtual species? Well, we did it in a fairly simple way. So all of the temperature and precipitation values that fell within rectangles were deemed suitable for these virtual species. And the specifics of the temperature and precipitation values that were suitable depended on where that species actually originated in geographic space, so where its seed point was. And this approach actually allowed us to keep the breadth of physiological tolerances the same across the virtual species. And we tested two different niche breaths. So a narrow one represented by this blue rectangle, and then a broad one represented by the pink rectangle. So we chose our narrow and broad definitions, so sort of tolerance levels based on a database that included 1,700 agriculturally important plant species. And just to walk you through a bit how I defined these tolerances, if the temperature condition at a seed point was 12 degrees, the narrow niche species would have a temperature tolerance limit of 4 to 20 degrees Celsius, while the broad niche species would have a tolerance limit of -8 to 32 degrees Celsius. Okay, so let's say the starting seed point for a virtual species was the temperature was 25 degrees Celsius. Well, in that case, the narrow niche breast species would have a tolerance limit of 17 to 33 degrees Celsius, and the broad niche species would have a tolerance limit of 5 to 45 degrees Celsius. And this same process was then applied to the precipitation dimension. As I said, species could actually move about this gridded landscape and search for suitable habitat. And their movement was controlled by their dispersal ability. And I tested two different dispersal abilities, a poor one and a good one. And these curves here, they're exponential decay curves. they describe the probability of dispersal for a species. So essentially, the steeper the curve, the more unlikely it is that a species will disperse long distances. So what's really useful about this simulation framework is that because we use virtual species, we could actually hold factors constant like this dispersal ability or like niche breadth across species and across latitudes, and then examine possible combinations of these traits like you see here. So now, hopefully that you understand a bit of the basics of the simulation framework. In the simulations themselves, climate change across space and through time could instigate three processes, which we've talked about: range shifts, speciation, and extinction. Speciation occurred through range fragmentation as a result of climate change, which I mentioned. So if populations remained isolated for a sufficient period of time or a certain period of time, this would actually result in speciation. And again, this is referred to as allopatric speciation, and it's the dominant mode of speciation that we think occurs in nature. So this is being illustrated here in this top panel. Extinction, on the other hand, would occur if all occupied suitable habitat for a species disappeared, again, as you see here. So we can have species shifting their distributions through in this gridded landscape, just like in the bird study that I talked to you about. We can have speciation via isolation of populations or fragments of a species range, and we can have extinction when all of the occupied suitable habitat for a species disappears. So we started each simulation using a single species at a single point on Earth, and we could then document how that species occupied geographic space changed and evolved over the course of the simulation. So from this, we could look at patterns of speciation and extinction. We could look at shifts in distribution that were instigated by climate change. And then ultimately, we could look at that resulting pattern of diversity across latitudes. So let's jump into the results. What we found was that we could replicate latitudinal diversity gradients using this simulation framework. And this is pretty amazing, at least I think it's pretty amazing, because all we did was place some initial points on Earth and give our species a dispersal ability and a tolerance level. And then we could watch how those species responded to realistic estimates of how we think the climate actually changed over the last 120,000 years. So what I'm showing you here is average latitudinal diversity, represented by the black line, and then we have confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals in the gray shading. And this is for species with narrow niches regardless of their dispersal ability. So this is the pattern resulting from our simulation framework. And we were essentially able to produce a diversity pattern that is remarkably similar to realistic diversity gradients that you see here for birds, for mammals, and for our amphibians. And this is starting from no diversity gradient. So that's pretty exciting that we can create a diversity gradient, but what caused it? We know that climate change was responsible, but which of the three processes that I mentioned, speciation, extinction, and dispersal, were responsible? Or was it some combination of all three processes? What becomes clear when the patterns are analyzed is that higher rates of speciation at low latitudes are contributing most to the pattern. So the tropics are a cradle. We're getting more origination or speciation in the tropics. And we actually don't see higher rates of extinction at higher latitudes. So instead, extinction rates actually seem to be fairly constant across latitudes. So what about dispersal? Well, when it comes to dispersal, more tropical species seem to disperse to temperate regions than vice versa. So in fact, actually, tropical species disperse to temperate regions more than twice that of temperate species dispersing to tropical regions. So what's interesting is that even though we have this migration of species from low latitudes, from the tropics to high latitudes, we still get a diversity gradient. And that's because the speciation pump in the tropics outweighs that steady leak of taxa from the tropics to temperate regions. We established that higher rates of speciation near the equator is what generated more species near the equator, and therefore established that latitudinal diversity gradient in the simulations. And this speciation was caused by the dynamics of climate, which resulted in range fragmentation of these species, isolation of those ranges and populations, and eventually speciation. But the question also becomes, what climatic variables actually drove this range fragmentation and therefore speciation? And we can examine this by looking at how climate varies spatially and temporally across the globe. And what becomes clear is that actually precipitation is the driving force. And this is illustrated by these maps. So what these maps are showing is the temporal variability of each climate variable. So the more peaks, the more variability in climate. And what you can see is that there's much more variability in precipitation at low latitudes than at high latitudes. Whereas temperature, there is not a lot of variability at low latitudes, which shouldn't be all that surprising to you. We can also look at this in a different way as well. So we can actually look at the direct effect of these climate variables on speciation and extinction. And what we see is that precipitation is the driving force for low latitude speciation. And that's ultimately then causing the diversity gradient in the simulation. But the simulation was run using data from only the last 120,000 years, so fairly recent in time. So the question then becomes, was precipitation always more variable spatially and temporally at low latitudes? And could this explanation actually explain the diversity gradient that we see further back in time and deeper in time? And I think the answer is likely yes. And this is because low latitude variability in precipitation was likely present throughout much of Earth history. And this is because atmospheric moisture is a strongly nonlinear function of temperature. So any small variation in temperature is amplified by the moisture cycle. So as long as the tropics were warm, which they were for most of Earth history, then high variability in precipitation was likely to have been present. So we might have had this strong speciation pump in the tropics for much of Earth history. The mechanism then that I just proposed could potentially explain why we see dampened diversity gradients during times of extreme warmth. So for example, during the late Cretaceous or the Eocene. In these climates, precipitation may have been more variable everywhere during these time periods, which would have potentially elevated speciation rates everywhere, making that diversity gradient more dampened or sort of more even across latitudes. So again, what I think is fairly exciting about this study is that with only minimal assumptions about how species interact with estimates of climate change over the last 120,000 years, and of course, assuming that speciation occurs when populations become isolated, so allopatrically, we're able to generate modern day latitudinal diversity gradients. And this actually supports previous studies that indicate the tropics is a cradle of diversity. So there's higher rates of speciation in the tropics. But I should note that glaciations and high latitude climate change on longer timescales than what we looked at in this simulation study likely did contribute to the diversity gradient and sharpen the diversity gradient. We just didn't study it on the appropriate timescale to get at that. So I've discussed how climate can instigate broad scale shifts in where we find groups, how these shifts over time maybe can explain ecological patterns like the latitudinal diversity gradient, especially when climate and particularly precipitation changes more at low latitudes. And this is where we find the most species. And in this last study that I'll share with you today, I want to continue to discuss how climate influences species over Earth history. And I am also going to continue to use the simulation framework that I just introduced. And this study was work done in collaboration with my colleague Seth Finnegan at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as many climate modelers, including Dan Lunt, Alex Farnsworth, and Paul Valdez at the University of Bristol. And the question we had in this study was whether continental configuration, essentially this means the shape of the continents, whether that affects extinction rates during climatic transitions. So the idea is that some continental arrangements will make it easier for species to track their suitable habitat when climate changes compared to other continental configurations. So for example, let's consider a species that live in shallow marine environments. In this case, for these shallow marine species, long north-south coastlines would be beneficial for habitat tracking as the temperature changes over time. And this is because these species could easily move along this north-south gradient to keep pace with their suitable habitat and with this changing climate. However, shallow marine species living on an island or living on an east-west oriented coastline would be more restricted. They could not easily escape changing temperatures or easily track climate change. And so we tested the idea that continental configuration might regulate extinction rates during greenhouse to icehouse transitions using the paleogeography from 3 time periods that experienced fairly significant climatic cooling. So they went from very warm greenhouse conditions to cool icehouse conditions. And these 3 time periods include the Ordovician, 460 million years ago, roughly, the Eocene to Oligocene, approximately 50 million years ago, and the Pliocene to Pleistocene, approximately 3 million years ago. And these climatic transitions from warm to cold were associated with significant biotic changes and upheaval, including shifts in species distributions, extinction, and speciation. But the Ordovician was characterized by much, much higher extinction rates than these other 2 events. And in fact, approximately 75% of species are estimated to have gone extinct over only a few million years during this time period, during this climatic transition. Since the magnitude of extinction then associated with the late Ordovician is far higher than those other 2 greenhouse to icehouse transitions, some researchers have suggested that additional factors must have been involved other than cooling, including factors like ocean anoxia or even heavy metal poisoning. One factor, though, that has not been quantitatively investigated before is the role of continental configuration in governing extinction magnitude or intensity. So the Ordovician world looked quite different from today, with many island continents and terrains, and it lacked very long north-south coastlines. And this is illustrated here. This is actually a reconstruction of what the late Ordovician world would have looked like. The terrestrial areas here are in white. And then sea surface temperature is being represented by this gradient from warm to cold as we go from the equator to the poles. And our hypothesis was that continental configuration might have played a role in regulating extinction intensity during these greenhouse to icehouse transitions. In other words, species might have been trapped more easily by contracting sea surface temperature belts and unable to disperse to regions within their thermal tolerances in this Ordovician world compared to those other greenhouse to icehouse transitions, where there is more long north-south coastline. So we tested this hypothesis, as I said, using that same simulation model that I presented from the latitudinal diversity gradient study. So remember that this is a model, uses a gridded world, so grid cells. And in this gridded world, virtual species could occupy the grid cells based on their assigned tolerances and based on their assigned dispersal abilities. And the temperature of each cell could change then during the simulation from warm to cold to represent that greenhouse to icehouse transition, and could be favorable or unfavorable for a species depending on whether it fell within the species tolerance limits. So the gridded world in these simulations included the shallow margins around continents, like I'm showing you here. We also looked at various definitions of these shallow marine margins, and I can talk to you about that if you're interested. And then just like in the previous study, each simulation was started from a particular point within these shallow continental margins. And we used 1,000 of these seed points for each of the 3 greenhouse to icehouse transitions, that Ordovician, the Eocene to Oligocene, and the Pliocene to Pleistocene. And from each of these initial points, a species could begin interacting with the environment and searching for suitable habitat. So a species suitable habitat was defined very similarly to the latitudinal diversity gradient study. And instead of just 2 niche breaths, like in the latitudinal diversity gradient study, I looked at 3 niche breaths here. And then a species, again, could occupy grid cells depending on their dispersal ability, which was, again, similar to the latitudinal diversity gradient study. Essentially, a species with poor dispersal ability could not search as far as one with good dispersal ability, and these were represented by these exponential decay curves. And what's really useful about a simulation framework is that I could hold all other factors constant aside from the one that I'm interested in to isolate its effects. So in this case, this factor of interest is paleogeography or continental configuration. So to hold everything else constant aside from paleogeography, I made an artificial temperature gradient that transitioned from warm to cold, like you see here. And then I stamped out the continental margins like a cookie cutter, which I'm going to show you here for the Eocene and the Ordovician. Using this model framework, then I could count the number of virtual species that went extinct during each of these greenhouse to icehouse transitions. And to keep things simple, I counted extinction as when all occupied suitable habitat disappeared, like you just saw happen here. So if a species couldn't occupy any suitable habitat anymore, either because of how the climate changed or because of its dispersal ability, then that counted as an extinction. And what we found is that purely as a function of geography or paleogeography, so keeping all other factors constant, the proportion of species expected to be driven to extinction in a cooling Ordovician world is substantially higher than in a cooling Eocene and a cooling Pliocene world. So paleogeography does seem to be an important factor that will influence extinction magnitude during periods of climate change. And we also see that extinction is higher on east-west coastlines and on islands in the simulation framework compared to extinction on north-south coastlines for all 3 time periods. And this is good, it's consistent with our expectation. However, and you might have noticed this, the difference in extinction magnitude caused by paleogeography alone was not very pronounced, and certainly not enough to call the Ordovician a mass extinction event relative to these 2 other events. So other factors must have been involved to cause the higher extinction that we see during the Ordovician compared to these other 2 time periods. And we tested 2 of these other factors, including the amount of temperature change that we think actually occurred during these climatic transitions. And this was derived from paleoclimate models. And then we also looked at the amount of sea level drop during each of these climate transitions. And when we include sequentially these additional factors, so in the temperature change scenario, we have both sea level drop and temperature change. What we get is that we see a significant increase in the magnitude of extinction during the Ordovician, and the magnitude of extinction during the Ordovician is much higher than those other 2 climate transitions. And in fact, actually, especially when we're considering the narrow niche breath scenarios, we see that the disparity is quite similar to what we actually see in the fossil record, which is pretty exciting and pretty remarkable. So I presented 3 studies this evening that illustrate how climate can have large-scale impacts on species by either spurring diversification, instigating extinction, and shifting where we find certain types of species on Earth. And in the first study, I showed that I can correctly predict the occurrences of bird fossils in the Northern Hemisphere 55 million years ago based on their present-day environmental tolerances. And this suggests a causal mechanism for these significant biogeographic shifts that have occurred in these groups. And of course, that is of a cooling climate. And in the second study, I showed that the dynamics of climate change can cause enhanced speciation potentially at low latitudes, which might actually have influence on one of these largest scale patterns that we see, which is the latitudinal diversity gradient. And so maybe the dynamics of climate change, particularly precipitation, is really what is contributing to increased speciation rates and therefore to the latitudinal diversity gradient. And then finally, in the third study, I showed that continental configuration can play a role in regulating extinction intensity or magnitude during climatic transitions. And I would say that although all three of these studies are rooted in the past, they have implications for how we understand and interpret biodiversity patterns today. And we all know that climate is changing today. And as I said, I'm very interested in the impact and effect of climate change today on species and into the future. So I think what we can do is take very similar approaches that I've shown you and talked to you about today and apply it to species that are especially vulnerable and project how they may fare under future climate change scenarios. And some of my work is doing exactly that, using models of dispersal to look at how species might respond to future climate changes, even out to say 2300. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and again to thank the Geological Society and Dan Lunt for the kind invitation to speak here tonight. None of this would have been possible without the hard work of my collaborators, without the hard work of members of my lab, without mentorship from my postdoc and PhD advisors, and without the generous funds from these institutions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erin, for your fascinating talk. I think we can imagine lots of silent claps of applause, claps of appreciation around the audience. And just to remind the people listening, there's a couple of reminders here. Firstly, this video will be live streamed. It's also recorded directly onto YouTube and will be uploaded on the Geological Society's channel over the coming days. So now we enter the Q&A. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and hopefully we can, or Erin can answer and address as many of those questions as is possible in the time allowed. And I can see there are some already appearing in the Q&A and also the chat. So I think you can also read them, Erin, but I will probably read them out just so that everyone is aware of the questions, and I'll just go in the order in which they were put up. So the first one is about those Paleogene bird localities. So some of them include paleonath birds. Perhaps you can let us know what they are, because I'm not entirely sure. So does your work show that the climate envelopes for these other bird groups like paleonaths are not so stable?
The only groups that I looked at, so those 10 groups actually all had very stable tolerances, and I was able to actually, so I just showed 2 examples in the talk for brevity's sake, but all 10 of the groups that I discussed actually had the same patterns replicated across them. We were able to model the present day tolerances and then project those models back into the past, millions and millions of years ago, and correctly predict where we find the fossils. And I should also mention that we didn't just say, oh, gee whiz, we correctly predicted the fossils. We wanted to know what's the probability that those fossils would have corresponded with predicted suitable habitat. So what's the chance that we would have kind of matched up our suitable habitat predictions with the fossils by chance? So we can do some statistical tests, and again, in most of the cases, it was a very unlikely scenario that we would actually have correctly predicted those fossil localities based on sort of the amount of suitable habitat that was predicted as suitable. So so I think in this case, all 10 of the bird clades that we looked at, or the bird groups that we looked at, did show remarkable stability in their niches.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Dan's question. I think you can unmute yourself, because we as the conveners cannot use the Q&A. So Dan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I just wondered whether you could comment on the, in the first example you gave, the PNES bird paper, obviously the niche modelling sort of indicated that you'd have, you know, extensive regions of potential suitable habitats in the northern and in the southern hemisphere, and yet obviously the paleofossils are only in the northern hemisphere. Is that a sort of a preservation bias or a search bias, or is there an actual mechanism that means they would, you know, the species weren't actually living there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think somebody else in the chat also had a similar question. How do we account for the issue that we actually don't have a lot of / any southern hemisphere fossils for a lot of these groups? I think it's probably a geopolitical factor. So, you know, there just hasn't been as much searching done for these fossils, but it could also be just as simply we don't have sediments of the right age, and we didn't have the right preservational conditions to preserve these fossils. In terms of how our results in our study is affected by the lack of fossils, the answer is that it's not really, because we weren't actually modeling anything in the fossil record itself. So what we were doing is we were taking the present day tolerances of these groups, which of course are very well known because people really like birds. So there's millions of occurrence data for birds in these groups, and then projecting these models onto the past. And so it would absolutely be great to have knowledge of whether the birds were actually in the southern hemisphere at that time and to have fossils, but it actually doesn't affect our model results at all. It's just, you know, it leaves open more questions about whether they were actually there or whether or not. You know, is it just a preservational bias, or is it a true absence?
Great, thanks very much.
Thanks, Erin. Can we move on to the extent to which these data sets are publicly available or shareable in any way? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what data sets you're referring to. So a lot of the climate model data are publicly available on various websites. So many of the climate models that I've utilized in collaboration with folks like Dan Lunt and Alex Farnsworth and Paul Valdez are online at the Bridge website, which is through Bristol. So it's the HAD CM3 climate models. But of course, you know, the latest and greatest models are sometimes not up there. So, you know, it's best to collaborate with the climate scientists who really know their models and know the limitations of their models. The occurrence data that are used for a lot of these studies are publicly available as well on databases like GBIF and in the PBDB, which is the fossil occurrence database. And then the model results from a lot of the studies, so like, for example, that first one, the bird niche modeling study, are available on Dryad in association with the publication of the paper. And if you are interested in a particular data set or in code or anything like that, I'm very happy to share it. So please do just get in touch.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I suspect you've already answered Niels's question together with Dan's, so we'll move on to John's, and he asks the million-dollar question there about present climate change. So does that mean, rather provocatively, that increasing temperature could lead to additional species diversity?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think the answer without human influence is yes, on, you know, thousands to tens of thousands to millions of years timescale. So if we didn't have humans around, and if we weren't increasing the temperature so dramatically and so quickly, then maybe the answer would be yes. But that is a very qualified yes, in the sense that you can't increase the temperature too much, and you can't increase the temperature too rapidly. And the time scale is such that it would be, you know, thousands to tens of thousands to millions of years into the future. And it's without humans. And so the answer is a resounding no when you take into account the reality, which is that we're increasing temperatures way too rapidly for probably species to be able to keep pace and to remain within their tolerance limits. humans are around and they are wreaking havoc on the biosphere and the geosphere. They are destroying habitat, they are polluting, etc. They're causing climate change. So in that sense, you know, I think the degradation and the extinction of species from both from climate change too quick of climate change and from habitat disruption and ecological disruptions will outweigh that. So no, I think actually we're in a biodiversity crisis, and a lot of paleontologists and biologists debate whether we're actually in a 6th mass extinction event. So there have been 5 mass extinction events in Earth history, putatively 5. People argue over that, at least 2 or 3. And the question is, are we sort of in the midst of, or at least soon to be in, another mass extinction event? And of course, mass extinctions are when large numbers of species disappear and go extinct. And the answer is probably yes, or at least we're heading there. And so you can look at rates of extirpation of populations, abundance decline, geographic range decline, but also just look at the species that have already been pushed to extinction by humans. And the situation is not good. And of course, you know, we humans rely on biodiversity for our food, our medicine, our infrastructure, everything, to clean our water, to make oxygen for us to breathe. So if we do have another mass extinction event, humans are really in for it, really.
Okay, so this is where I get to ask my question, because I think we've got a lot of questions in the chat. So I have one quick question about the late Ordovician mass extinction. So you mentioned that when you include the sea level change, that you get much closer to what we know from the fossil record. So just could you just explain what the extinction mechanism is with sea level change? The late Ordovician, I have heard it mentioned for other extinctions as well, but what's actually going on there in terms of causing the extinction?
So just to confirm that I understood your question, so you were saying what is actually causing the extinction as a result of the drop in sea level, is that right? Yeah, so essentially it's that there's less habitat available for these, and especially when you have shallow epiric seas. So these are just shallow, warm seas that were sort of on continental interiors. And so when you drain those seas because you're making ice at your poles, then those species don't have anywhere to go, and their dispersal rate is probably not fast enough to get to more suitable, like shallow marine habitat. So it's really just loss of habitat and too significant loss of habitat for them to, I mean, again, it's a simulation, right? But that's the idea.
It's essentially habitat loss. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. If anybody has a final quick question, I suspect not. I think we've run out of questions, and that's probably all we have time for anyway. It's 1 or 2 minutes to 6 o'clock. So just remains to thank Erin once again for a fascinating talk. And good evening to you all. And make sure you tune in for the next talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'll close down now. Have a good evening.